my hunch is that the fastest and best way for us to work and ultimately to be part of these projects is going to be in cases where there's a startup who has talked to a couple of infrastructure investors and has some interest, and where there's maybe someone who's saying, hey, we love your technology. We think what you're doing is great. We've noted that you've got a great, strong offtake agreement. And then there's maybe a but somewhere in there, and there often is with these projects. And so it's like, let's talk at that point to see if there's something we can do specifically around this particular risk that's emerging as the reason that this might not be easy to bring together with respect to traditional investors. But if there's someone else that we can already run alongside and ultimately crowd in with our catalytic capital, that's going to be a really great place for us to be.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Climate Tech 360, where we connect with diverse voices in the climate sector to make informed choices in supporting the future of climate tech. I'm your host, Samia, and today we are speaking with Lara Pierpoint, the co-CEO of Prime Coalition and the managing director for Prime's newly launched Trellis Climate program. Before joining Prime as co-CEO, Lara built the Actuate Climate program to design interventions that get emissions-reducing technologies on the ground faster. In December of 2022, Actuate Climate and the Prime team decided to join forces, and Lara's team and programs became Trellis Climate. Prior to Actuate, Lara worked on energy technology innovation at Exelon. And before her time at Exelon, she directed the Office of Energy Supply Security in the U.S. DOE Office of Policy and Systems Analysis, where she was responsible for policy and analysis related to coal, gas, and nuclear power, and energy, cyber, and physical security. Lara received a PhD from MIT in engineering systems, studying the deployment of advanced technologies for nuclear waste recycling. And she holds a dual master's degree from MIT in nuclear engineering and technology policy. She completed her BS in physics at UCLA. In this episode, we talk about catalytic capital and how it can be used to address the funding gap for first-of-a-kind or early infrastructure projects in climate tech. We also get into details on Prime Coalition's newly launched Trellis Climate program, which is an impact-first catalytic capital program enabling novel climate infrastructure solutions to achieve commercial scale at speed. We also get into details on Prime Coalition's newly launched Trellis Climate program, which is an impact-first catalytic capital program enabling novel climate infrastructure solutions to achieve commercial scale at speed, and is committed to accelerating the deployment of FOAK climate projects. Now, if you're not familiar with FOAK or FOAK financing, please refer to the episode that I recorded with Petros Lakakis at Wavelength Infrastructure in season 1. This is an important topic and one that I will continue to cover. And now on to the episode. Well, thank you for being here. I am really excited to talk about your new program. I've seen press releases, I've seen, notes and LinkedIn posts of you talking about it in San Francisco Climate Week. And I wanted to give this audience the opportunity to hear all about this Trellis Climate program that you're developing.
Awesome. I'm so excited to be here.
So tell me a little bit about it. I mean, Prime Coalition, obviously, anyone who works in climate in the US or outside knows a lot about it. You have been doing so much work on this in this space in particular. I mean, I was looking at that report that you put out that is titled Barriers to the Timely Deployment of Climate Infrastructure, which I will link in the show notes. And that, I believe, even predates you joining Prime Coalition, which you mentioned. So the organization's been doing so much research on this for so long. And it's a topic that I've brought up on this podcast, but never through the lens of how do we solve this problem using catalytic capital. So tell me a little bit about about the program, what it is, and how it came to fruition.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. So many things to say. So maybe I'll start from the beginning with the Prime Coalition, because I think this will help motivate and kind of define what we mean when we say catalytic capital. So a long time ago, back when I was in graduate school at the same time as Sarah Carney, who's the founder of the Prime Coalition, part of what Sarah realized was that there are really incredible tools for bringing charitable dollars into for-profit companies and projects, and that there are ways to do that, but that they they hadn't really been used at all in the climate sector. And she said, hey, there's this big tool out there that we could be using to support climate technology development. What is it going to take to actually start to mobilize this money? And so that was the question that she really dug into deeply within her graduate research. And it led to her founding the Prime Coalition, because part of what she discovered is that, this would be so much easier to do if there were a nonprofit who could really serve as an intermediary to work with foundations and charitable sources of funding and with climate companies to figure out how to actually make this happen. So that was the genesis of the Prime Coalition. And at the time that she founded Prime in 2014, we were coming off of sort of the end of the Climate Tech 1.0 phase. And as I think a lot of people know, that meant there was not much funding, period, for anything in climate that was for profit. There was a big retrenchment in venture capital because a lot of these companies had effectively gone bankrupt after, this first try towards the end of the 2000s. And so in this moment, there really wasn't a lot of money to support early stage climate innovation companies. And so that's where Prime decided to focus its efforts. And over the last 10 years, they have built a very successful catalytic capital program that effectively serves the kind of venture world and exists within the venture world. And that's culminated in the Azola Fund, which exists today. Azola is actually a blended finance fund. So it's $240 million in capital. And of that, about 80 million is catalytic capital. So that means it comes from philanthropic sources. The rest we call full cycle capital, which is to say it's sort of traditional venture capital. And when Azola invests, it invests in companies that have a really strong climate impact mission. And it does so through this blended finance vehicle that really enables it to, I would say, Azola to kind of lean forward on risk a little bit, go for the things that are really potentially high impact, but wouldn't otherwise be fundable by traditional venture capital alone. So all this is to say that out there are a lot of definitions for the word catalytic capital.
Yes,
what we mean when we say that is capital that comes from philanthropic sources that really has an impact first mission, but not, I would say, an impact only mission. We really want to be able to run along with and crowd in sources of traditional finance. And so Prime pioneered this for, again, the early sort of venture capital stages. And that was the foundation of a lot of the work that we're doing now.
Great. And how did you get looped in? Is it because you were at MIT, right? And did you meet Sarah through that? And then you were brought into Prime Coalition?
Yeah. Well, so the next phase of the story is that, as Prime has been serving the sort of early stages of the innovation pipeline for climate, part of what they realized, and a lot of people had realized, is obviously this isn't the only challenge, right? Like, it's very important to get companies off the ground and to get them running through their paces when it comes to doing technology development. But there are huge challenges at later stages in the pipeline too. And additional, some people call this the second valley of death, or, in some cases you can have the third and fourth valley of death. But in any case, we know that there are challenges with commercialization. So that led to several years ago, Prime basically commissioning this report called Barriers to the Timely Deployment of Infrastructure. It was written by my colleague, Karine Kacharian. And what Karine did was she really dove into the later stage, challenges that exist in the climate tech innovation pipeline and really looked at the finance community and the set of finance tools that are out there and tried to figure out where are the gaps, where are the places where the finance tools we have, the kinds of investment that are available may not match what we actually need to do with climate. And of course, what she discovered in that report is that there are sort of 4 canonical types of gaps that exist at these later stages, and they're all pretty acute. There are really a lot of reasons why it's very difficult, I think, for climate companies to get across this particular chasm and get to their stages of commercialization. So that was what was happening on the Prime side. On my side, I've had a career that's kind of gone through the federal government, and I worked at Exelon, a big electric utility. So I was in the corporate world. I did some venture investing there. I managed the R&D program. We got in some grants. So I was working on climate technologies from a lot of different angles, including since my academic life ages ago. And part of what was really frustrating me was how much more work we needed to do on scaling and commercialization more generally. So when I left my job at Exelon, it was to co-found a nonprofit called Actuate Climate. And our goal with Actuate was really to focus on systems issues and say, how can we solve those gnarly systems problems that make it so hard to scale climate technology? And so I was really heavily focused on climate technology scaling. So was Prime at the time. And Sarah and I have been friends forever. So I knew about what Prime was doing. I was interacting with Karina a lot as she was writing her report, was really excited about what they were doing. And then we had some changes that were happening at Actuate. We were going to sort of move forward. But in that process, Sarah and I started talking. And what we realized is that her version for what she wanted to do with Prime around scaling climate technologies and what I was doing at Actuate, we both had really strongly aligned visions. And so we started talking, and ultimately we decided effectively to kind of merge our nonprofits. And so I spun what was Actuate Climate into Prime, and that became Trellis Climate.
That's so fun.
Yeah.
That you knew each other.
It was really
fun.
fun.
Your MIT days, and you combined the two companies. I'm curious, this is like a side note, but when I was looking at your profile, you obviously have very technical degrees from the most technical university in the world. What made you, the scale problem is more of like a finance and a business problem. What made you care about that so much?
That's a great question. I have always been someone who is defined kind of by breadth and not just the science and technology side. I kind of tell the story that I was a science and technology kid from the beginning. Like I was really into math. I was really into science, like ever since I was in elementary school. And so I knew that was going to be core to my pathway. But then when I was in college, I took a class called Science and Society. And it was the first time someone told me I might not have to pick and do just science and math and technology development. And I was hooked. Ever since then, I was like, this is where I want to be, is at the intersection of all of these different worlds, because this is where there are really interesting problems. This is how problems get solved, is by triangulating across all of these things. And so I've really kind of always been there. That's why technology and policy is one of the degrees that I did when I was in graduate school. I was really always thinking about technology development and also how does that interact with the world, and how do we get the best out of our technology and mitigate the worst, and ultimately, in this case, solve the climate problem. And it really takes so much more than technology to solve the climate problem. So that's why I'm here.
When you say you were interested in science and tech from a young age, was that you played with insects when everyone else was inside playing video games?
I wasn't so much an insect girl. You want to know what it was? This is even dorkier, I think. I was really obsessed with astronomy and the stars. And so I was always...
dorky? Beautiful.
It's pretty dorky. I was staring at the sky all the time and memorizing constellations.
Your parents were probably like, why does this child stare at the sky all the time? There's something wrong with her.
Yeah. So no, I got my start in astrophysics, actually.
Okay. So we know about the genesis now. And if you were to define this problem, I'm glad that you defined catalytic capital. I think that's important, because I do think that people sort of throw that term around without really thinking about what it is. If you were to talk about the gap in first-of-a-kind financing, how would you define that?
Okay, the gap in first-of-a-kind financing. So I think what we are seeing, and we've been studying this really closely, obviously starting with Karine and then my team over about the last 2 years at this point, we've been looking at the companies that are, again, kind of getting through their paces, doing what they need to do around technology development. And the great news is that they're being successful in raising successive, venture funding rounds. And then we see that there's this moment where they need to build a plant, and it needs to be large. There's typically some engineering scale-up risk associated with building this plant. So you've built it at pilot or demo scale, but now you're going to build it at a much bigger scale. Plenty of tech risk that may still be sort of inherent, particularly in that scale-up process. And the goal with this first commercial plant is that you're going to have a customer and you're going to have revenue. You're actually going to be producing real things. And ideally, you're going to be doing all of that at a scale that's replicable, so that it's not just this one plant, but it's like this is now the beginning of a series of pieces of infrastructure that ultimately you're going to build. And it's this moment that's incredibly challenging. There are a lot of reasons for that. I think just to name one of the biggest ones that we talk about a lot in the community, it's actually about skill sets. So the reality is that if you're a really successful technology development company, you've got a lot of strong technology folks, you've got some people who really understand how to create business models. Most likely, you've built a culture that's rooted in the Silicon Valley startup ecosystem, where it's like move fast, fail fast, break things, do what you can to move forward, which is great and probably is the reason that you've been successful, again, raising these successive venture funding rounds. But that is about the opposite of the culture that you want when you're building a large, complex project. You need to go slow. You need to very much not break things.
Yeah.
There are a whole lot of skill sets around what it takes to finance and to do that. So it's a huge cultural shift. It's a huge skill shift. And it's not one that tends to exist endemically throughout the startup ecosystem. So that's one big challenge, is that I think companies are starting to realize they need to hire differently. They need to figure out how to get support around just, again, the skill sets and the sort of plan of attack that they require. The other thing that we've realized is that, again, the financial tools really aren't available for this. So venture capital was kind of built, in large part, I would say, with a sort of software focus in mind, where there are really potentially big returns, where the amount of money it takes to actually get that huge exit that you require, that huge portfolio return on that one unicorn company. There's sort of a whole profile associated with venture that works incredibly well if you're building software and is much more difficult if you're building hardware. So I think that's one of the biggest issues. And S2G produced a report last year that noted this, that said, okay, when it comes to like the big venture funding rounds, we've got a dearth of checks that are willing to write these big growth equity checks. Then on the other side of the equation, if you can sort of like get across the rainbow to where you're fairly well de-risked, there's a lot of infrastructure capital out there. And S2G documented that too. They noted that there's about $400 billion in infrastructure investment financing that's available very specifically for the energy transition. So that's a huge deal. The problem is that, as we know, infrastructure investment capital wasn't really built for these kinds of projects either. It's really meant to do things where there's a very clear cost structure, where the cash flows are completely locked up and clear, where there's almost no risk associated with the project. And it works really well right now if you're trying to finance solar and wind, obviously with some exceptions and some challenges associated with it. But in general, these structures work for those highly commercialized technologies. And we honestly don't really have anything that's purpose-built for this moment, where you're kind of transitioning out of venture into a world where you're ultimately going to want to actually access infrastructure capital. But there is so much risk, particularly for that first project, and sometimes for the second or third as well.
Yeah. And then you have also project finance coming in that also doesn't take in the technology risk, but they come in at sort of technology readiness 8 or 9, but they're really evaluating things from a commercial perspective and doing due diligence. In that report that you guys published, there was a really good visual around this showing where that gap is, which is what you described between that leaping between sort of venture and infrastructure. Yeah. So this report that you put out, which was very detailed, and big shout out to your colleague. I thought it was such a well-written report. That was published, I want to say like 3 years ago or something.
Yeah.
And I imagine it took a while to write.
It did. I think it took Corinne a little over a year.
Yeah.
A lot of work.
Yeah. It looked like it was a lot of work. And in order to do that report, Prime Coalition, your colleague, interviewed 140 senior members in climate tech ecosystem, identifying those 4 gaps. So when did you really start thinking about this problem and thinking about, all right, we need to develop this program? Any conversation that you have around climate tech now brings up this issue of first of a kind or nth of a kind financing. But you guys have been doing sort of the heavy lifting and research around it for a long time. And the reason why I think it's so interesting and why I wanted you to come on and talk about this is because your approach is different. You spent years researching it, and you are working with Catalytic Capital, which I've seen a lot of things pop up on LinkedIn of people saying, oh, we're going to start a first of a kind fund. Some of us are going to do it in debt. Or even if you were to do it with equity necessarily, there's a bit of an imbalance in terms of sort of the risk return profile, right? Because it's so risky and the returns are potentially lower because it's later stage. It's not early stage VC. So tell me the timeline of when you joined, when this report came about, and how long the Trellis program has been in the works.
Yeah, I mean, the timeline is kind of an interesting one, and it's not exactly a direct and linear one, especially given some of the nonprofit mergers that were involved in the middle of all this. But here's what I would say about this is that I think as an ecosystem, there have been some rumblings and some recognition around this as a challenge for quite a long time. And that was, again, part of the reason that almost 5 years ago now, I left Exelon, was that I was looking around and I was saying, okay, this is, as an ecosystem, we've started to do better around some of the early stage innovation. We need more work there, but certainly given some hard tech incubators, given the presence of Azola in the world, we have RPE, we have all kinds of things that are kind of supporting some of the early stage venture work. there was almost nothing that was doing a similar job as sort of like an ecosystem support on the later stages, and particularly around scaling. And so that's why I left Axelon to found Actuate, was really to figure out how can we bring resources to bear on this that go beyond just what venture capitalists can do on their own, or what existing university systems can do on their own. And so I think, we've been thinking about that for quite some time. Obviously, Prime was working on this and it wasn't like Prime decided overnight in 2021 to get this report written. This was something that had been on the radar screen for quite some time for them. And I think, honestly, a lot of the infrastructure investors out there have seen this for, over a decade. They've been watching and saying, we want to invest in the energy transition. And they've been looking at what's happening in the innovation ecosystem and saying, we don't know how this is going to work, y'all. Like, how are you actually going to get these technologies all the way over to where we actually feel like we can do this? So I think, the startup ecosystem has come to this realization, perhaps like on the whole, a little bit more recently, obviously with some exceptions. But I would say that I think a couple of years ago, there were not that many of us really talking about this loudly. And that has changed really dramatically in the last 2 years. I think it has started to get really obvious, particularly because we had so much venture investment just a couple of years ago. So there are a lot more companies. There are a lot more venture investors out there. So there are just so many more opportunities for this to work well, which is really exciting, but it's really sharpened everyone's attention on how challenging this particular gap can be and this problem is to solve. So I'm delighted about that. I will say that over the last year or so, there have been a huge number of people that have come to the table. There are sort of informal groups of us that are gathering to talk about this with all sorts of different perspectives and resources to come help solve this problem. So I'm feeling really energized by the momentum we have around actually getting some work done to make this happen for the climate tech community.
So Prime Coalition has previously worked with Blended Capital. I was talking to another guest on the podcast. We haven't recorded yet, but I was speaking with her about this. So she's an infrastructure investor, and she's been investing in the infrastructure space for like 2 decades. And she talked about the challenges of structuring deals between infrastructure funds and blended capital because the interests aren't necessarily aligned. When you talk about a fund, they're focused on investment return, and for blended finance, they prioritize impact over returns. So how do you think about that when you're combining private capital that's focused on returns with philanthropic money? Because I think sometimes the philanthropic money can feel frustrated that they're effectively funding or subsidizing the investment.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, so many things in what you said there. So let me start with this to say that philanthropic catalytic capital, I think, again, in our case, we think of it as impact first. But again, to echo the statement I made earlier, it's really not just impact only. So here's the situation, right? If we're out there and we're philanthropy and we're chasing impact and we don't care at all about returns, the chances that we are backing the right technologies and that are ultimately going to scale get lower. So it's really important to us that we are focused on things that we think have a chance of scaling. And ultimately that means that they have to be able to scale without catalytic capital in the future. In other words, that if we can fund and support the first and maybe even second or third of a kind, that there is a path to these technologies standing on their own and scaling globally. And that matters to us, not just, because we like to see things go well. It's because that's actually the fastest route to impact, right? Like if we back the kinds of technologies that have a scaling future, we are going to get points on the board for greenhouse gas reduction faster. So in that sense, I would say that we actually have a really strong alignment. Now, it's true that when we come in and we work with traditional investors, they are often coming in with a finance first mindset and with the idea that obviously they want to make money first. Many of them also, of course, have impact as part of their mission. And in general, the investors that we work with are going to have impact as part of their mission. If they don't at all, the chances that we find alignment and can work together are relatively low. But the good news is that there are a lot of infrastructure investors out there right now that do consider impact as key to their mission, whether or not it's, obviously secondary to their sort of financial mission. And so I think in those cases, we really can work together because what we want is for these technologies to go somewhere. That's obviously what these financial investors want too. And I think, honestly, this is one of the biggest strengths of Prime is that we think about this very explicitly. Our goal is to crowd in as much traditional investment as possible on the deals that we do. And then especially sort of in the future, we want to make sure that we're setting things up for a successful pathway. And so this means that our job is really difficult because philanthropy can come in and sort of give grants and things like that. And there are definitely cases where that's warranted and where moving fast and just kind of getting some money out there might be the right answer. But we try to be much more structured, much more careful about making sure that we're running alongside the financial community and meeting them where they are. Because again, we actually think that's the best way to serve our impact mission. So that's kind of how we play with that. Now, you said something else though too, which is that philanthropy doesn't want to be lining the pockets of traditional investors. And that's absolutely true. And that's another really big challenge. And that's something we have to balance with what I just said, is that we also have to be ultra careful to make sure that we are in deals where we are needed and not where we are wanted. And so that's a big focus of our underwriting criteria throughout Prime's programs. We have, we call it additionality. And additionality is a huge loaded word. It's also one that probably has as many definitions as there are humans that use that word. But we're working on trying to get some alignment there. And one of my colleagues at Prime, Carrie Browder, who is the director of impact accountability, she's working with a lot of infrastructure investment firms and other investors to figure out how do we really define this term. But it's something that we use in our underwriting criteria to mean we need to be there again because we're needed. And so it's a case where this project wouldn't go forward but for the presence of catalytic capital, or there's a reason that catalytic capital dramatically accelerates the timeline for this particular technology's development if we come in and work with investors on this project. I'm not going to tell you that it's easy to assess that and to feel really good that you have the right assessment, but we see it as absolutely vital, and it's a big piece of what we do at Prime throughout all of our programs.
So does that mean effectively, I don't know if I'm oversimplifying it, but if you see something that comes your way and it's oversubscribed and there's 7 term sheets for this thing and they have the whole round, you won't touch it?
Exactly. We were like, great, this is awesome.
Good
so
for
excited
you.
everyone's investing. It's like, it's honestly, we kind of celebrate in those situations, right? Like if we can't participate because there's so much traditional investment that wants to go into something, that's awesome.
Yeah.
We're like, that's, let's move forward. And then we go for the cases that are a little bit more difficult than that.
Are there any specific metrics that you look for? Like, let's just say it's at a stage where funds would specifically look for a revenue, certain revenues, and you feel like they just haven't made it. Is that something you would look at and say, okay, this company checks all the boxes, but they haven't generated any revenues, and therefore nobody will give them a term sheet, so we'll step in here?
Yeah, I think you're heading at kind of the way that we think about this, which is that as we're evaluating an opportunity, the first question is traditional capital in some form going to come and crowd in and fund this, in Azola's case, will they fund this company? In our case, it's probably, will they fund this project? So we ask that first, and we look for some evidence around that, right? So we'll be asking questions within the Trellis Climate program, like, okay, you've got this project that you're about to go build. How many infrastructure investment firms have you talked to? What have they told you? Why have they told you no? And then this gets into kind of the second piece of this, which is, are there specific risk factors that are relevant to your particular project that mean that this is going to be something that's challenging to fund? And we want to get really specific about this because part of what we're seeing is that it varies from project to project, the risk factors that feel particularly challenging. And so to give one really specific example, there was one case where there's a company that's building a particular plant, but they've got really new membranes that are sort of the bespoke special technology sauce that they're bringing to the table. And that's great. But given that that is a huge piece of the CapEx for this particular plant, and also that these membranes can't necessarily be used in a different industry or in a different plant anywhere, that means they're not exactly a saleable asset. And it's hard to consider them then as collateral in that particular deal. So there's some cases like that where there's just like one really specific thing that might be the reason the project economics are not quite adding up. And that's really what we want to drill into. And so we'll see, I think particularly since this is early days in general for this work, we're going to be looking kind of deal by deal and really trying to understand what the risk factors are. We'll be looking for patterns, but we suspect that there's going to be some differentiation around the particular reasons that these deals are hard to do.
That doesn't sound that dissimilar from breakthroughs model. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say Breakthrough Energy Catalyst is our closest cousin. We're super excited about what they're doing. They're operating at a very high level with some solid check sizes. I think there are a couple of things that make us different. One is that we have a very explicit mission, not just to the climate ecosystem, but also to philanthropists. So Prime's goal is not just to do well by the climate tech ecosystem. It's also to bring in as many philanthropists as possible, continue to crowd in more philanthropy, expand the groups of people and the amount of money that are flowing into these spaces. So we're looking not just for what's replicable for the companies, we're also looking at what's replicable for the philanthropic ecosystem.
Okay, so this would be a hypothetical scenario of a company that's already had a pilot plant and they have an offtake agreement, but they're still having issues with EPCs. And therefore you come in and you say, okay, they have the offtake in place. We feel confident that they can execute this. We would be willing to backstop some sort of insurance agreement on top of that.
Potentially, that's one way we could work with them. Yeah. So I think first and foremost, we're willing to talk to startups at a number of different stages in their journey. And we've talked to folks as early as, hey, I'm in the process of structuring my demo project and I'm trying to think about the parameters and what I should be tracking with respect to performance metrics so that I can be in good stead to raise project finance down the line. So we're happy to talk to folks as early as, being in those stages. And I think we're going to see exactly what the sweet spot is. My hunch is that the fastest and best way for us to work and ultimately to be part of these projects is going to be in cases where there's a startup who has talked to a couple of infrastructure investors and has some interest, and where there's maybe someone who's saying, hey, we love your technology. We think what you're doing is great. We've noted that you've got a great, strong offtake agreement. And then there's maybe a but somewhere in there, and there often is with these projects. And so it's like, let's talk at that point to see if there's something we can do specifically around this particular risk that's emerging as the reason that this might not be easy to bring together with respect to traditional investors. But if there's someone else that we can already run alongside and ultimately crowd in with our catalytic capital, that's going to be a really great place for us to be.
Gotcha. Okay, so you have announced on your website that you already made a couple of small investments in Ample Carbon and Ebb Carbon. And without revealing anything confidential, of course, I was just wondering, how would deals like that be structured? At what stage was it when they come to you? Do you help them bring in the catalytic capital, or do they come to you already and they say, we have a grant, we have all, if I'm a startup and I come to you, maybe there's no typical stage, but what stage am I in? And then what are you doing to service and put the deal together effectively?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, let me start by saying this. If you are a startup and you're doing sort of a seed through Series A, and you suspect you might need catalytic capital, so that is to say, your technology is super high impact and the world is going to need it, but there's maybe some risk reason that traditional venture capitalists are not quite on board. And there could be a number of those. My short answer is please talk to my colleagues at Azola. They're amazing. They're up and running. They're investing in some very awesome things. So that's kind of the place to go there. Then in terms of the Trellis program, we're a little bit later stage. So these first two syndicated investments that we did last year in Ebb and Ample were a little bit earlier stage than what we're likely to focus on going forward. So specifically to harken back to the barriers report, and we talked about those 4 gaps that Karine substantiated. One of those was with development capital. And so when we say development capital, we mean essentially the capital that's required to kind of do the project initialization work. So that's engineering studies, it's getting permits, it's doing site acquisition, it's all the things that you kind of want to have in place before you go raise your project finance. And interestingly enough, it can be hard to raise money for those activities, even if you have a fairly de-risked technology, in part because even though it's not necessarily a lot of money, at least compared to the project financing to do those things, there's just a lot of binary risk, because at any point you could discover, it turns out this site isn't going to work, or this particular engineering configuration isn't going to work, and then all this money that you've spent is for nothing. So we started last year by looking very specifically at that space. And we did that for a couple reasons. One was that we knew that with a relatively smaller check size, we could do something that would be truly catalytic for a couple of companies. And the other is obviously we just wanted to understand this space and figure out, is there is this a problem? Is it going to continue to be a problem with startups? How big of an issue is that going to create when it comes to project finance? And we do find that this is an issue, that one of the things that happens pretty often is that startups, they're raising venture capital. Again, venture money is expensive. There are a lot of competing uses for that funding. Once it comes into the top co, you're going to want to focus on some things that are going to raise your valuation for the next round. And this kind of stuff may or may not do that, depending on whether it truly leads to a project. So in a lot of cases, you'll see that venture-backed companies are sort of squeezing and reducing how much money they spend during these project development stages. And what that does is it basically pushes risk later, because you're not eliminating those risks at the time that you should. You're sort of doing a very light version of an engineering study. And that means that there are problems that you might uncover, much further down the road when you're actually like partway into building your project. That's sort of the worst case scenario. So these were some of the things that we observed. And what we did, we had a group of roughly 25 different philanthropic organizations that we were working with over the course of last year to kind of educate them and us about how we could work together around this problem. And we said to all of them, okay, we've seen that development capital funding is a challenge. We have a couple of companies that we've been talking to that could benefit from having more funding here because they're struggling to find funding specifically for these activities. And so we sort of made a small pipeline of those and narrowed it down to these two companies that we thought had incredibly high impact potential and we thought would benefit from some very specific funding around project development activities. And so we funded them both to do this. In both cases, these were probably somewhat earlier stage companies than what we're likely to work with down the road, because this is, again, they were sort of, actually both of them have technologies that we think can move forward fairly quickly. So they're sort of early stage companies, but with technologies that can go relatively quickly into projects. And I think, again, moving forward, we're going to be a little bit more focused now on the project construction financing gap. And that means that we're going to be working with companies that are a little bit later stage. But I would say in general, for the companies that are moving through this journey, don't count yourself out. Like always reach out to us and we can figure out if you're a potential fit for what Isola is up to or what we're up to. Because again, this is a journey that is not a cookie cutter style thing. And it's not, the same stage of company or the same kind of scenario that we're seeing in all these circumstances.
So for those two deals, did you work to bring in the catalytic capital? They were syndicated deals. So you obviously brought in some external capital. And then did you also bring in any sort of grants or philanthropic capital?
So this was all philanthropic capital. So basically what we did was for both of those deals, we worked with philanthropies and they effectively funded both of these. So we syndicated philanthropy and came into both deals again to provide this. And in neither case was it a straight grant. I'll leave it at that because we can't talk too much about the details of the transactions. But there are some interesting ways that we can support them and effectively invest charitable capital into their companies. And so that's what we did. So it's all charitable capital that came in on both of those deals. And that's, I think, a good model for how we're going to work in general in the near term is, really thinking about kind of bringing the catalytic capital side of the equation and then working with others on bringing the traditional financial capital into any specific deal.
Got it. And they were both removals companies. Do you think that there are certain types of technologies that are more in need of this type of catalytic capital to bridge the financing gap?
Yeah, it's a great question. In this case, we focused a little bit more heavily on carbon dioxide removal for a couple of reasons. One was that we had some folks within our sort of philanthropy network that were really interested in those technologies in particular. But we also, because we were kind of moving quickly, we were like, let's not boil the ocean. Let's focus in on one technology vertical that we know we want to know a fair bit about. We're in the process right now of looking across the field of greenhouse gas reduction and removal technologies and figuring out where we want to focus our efforts. And so there's some obvious ones that are bubbling up for us. Like, for example, industrial heat decarbonization is a big one. I'm really interested in technologies that support renewables existing on the grid and electrification. So that gets into all sorts of energy storage, things that are sort of demand flexibility related. We're looking really heavily at hydrogen right now to figure out what's needed in that space and particularly what can be additional. So we have some big questions about that one, but that's something that we're exploring. So yeah, I think I would say there are a number of technology verticals that are particularly ripe for these kinds of interventions and sets of technology verticals that can be a little bit harder to fund. I think as an ecosystem, it's really useful to have this conversation and to start to be clear about the reasons for this. Like, for example, one of the reasons that carbon dioxide removal is a tricky space to find the project financing is because of the market and or lack thereof, right?
Right. It's voluntary market.
So that's a really big risk factor that isn't going to go away if you fund a single project. And so that's why I think, Frontier and others are doing real heroes work to try to figure out how do we actually create a market signal that works, because that's what's ultimately going to be needed if we're really going to build these things in a sustainable way.
And how do you think about something like hydrogen? Because hydrogen is obviously getting a lot of funding from oil and gas and fossil fuel companies. It's something that they understand. So there's a lot of capital potentially later stage, not a lot early stage, because venture funds, for the most part, are trying to figure out, should we be should we be investing in these hydrogen companies? Can we really move the needle? So how do you think about that in terms of additionality?
Oh my gosh, yeah, hydrogen is like it's such a squirrely field right now, and I mean that. I would say in like this is going to sound weird. I mean that in a good way. There's so much going on, and so when I say squirrely, I mean it makes it squirrely for us to figure out is like, where really can we be additional? Is this something that really requires catalytic capital support? Those are our biggest questions right now. Yeah. So I think, my questions in hydrogen start with, first of all, like, how much hydrogen do we need? I'm a huge believer that we need to decarbonize existing uses of hydrogen. I think the question around just how much bigger does hydrogen demand get is a really big one that we need to keep asking ourselves. So that's one thing. I think another thing that makes this a little bit tricky for us is that the incentives and the Inflation Reduction Act are really incredible for hydrogen. So there's a lot of momentum and a lot of interest. And again, that's reflected partly in what you said, right? That there are a lot of oil and gas companies that are interested in funding these technologies. So a lot of, I don't know that we can say yet that there's tons and tons of investment flowing, but it seems like there are a lot of folks looking very closely at this and considering whether to do it. The other thing that makes it interesting is that from a technology development perspective, the traditional PEM and alkaline electrolyzers, we know what we're doing there. Those are not necessarily hugely novel technologies. And one of the things that we think about within Prime all the time is not that we always have to be backing the newest, most novel technology. Like, if we are dramatically expanding and accelerating the deployment of something we know how to do, that's a huge win for the climate. So we're definitely here for those strategies too. But one of the questions that we're as a team asking is like, okay, let's look at solid oxide electrolyzers. What are the kinds of benefits associated there? Is that going to be the space that's relatively underfunded because of the technology risk? And is there a reason for us to focus there? So I don't have strong answers to these questions just yet. We're just starting to ask and answer them as we figure out the degree to which we want to focus on this particular space.
So as a final question, if you had a call to action to climate tech startups, either for Trellis or for Zola, what would it be? What stage? If you were to say, okay, if you're a climate tech startup at this stage looking for this type of funding, or you've struggled with XYZ, come talk to us. Even if you're not ready for this funding now, come talk to us a year early, or whatever it may be.
Here is my call to action for startups, regardless of stage, type of funding sought, technology development moment, whatever it is. My call to action is very simple. Start thinking about this now. And I literally mean that, like, even if you're in the pre-seed phase, like, I think it's so important to start thinking about what is your long-term vision and how are you going to cross this gap, because this is no joke. And I think the earlier that companies are starting to think about what are their specific needs when it comes to bridging from venture capital into infrastructure capital and global deployment, the higher chances they'll have of actually walking across that bridge. So that means a number of different things. It means hiring people with skills that really understand projects. Again, not just in the moment when you're ready to build a project, but earlier on when you're making design decisions around your technology. It means working with venture capitalists and other kinds of investors within the ecosystem, making friends, getting mentors for all those same reasons, to make sure that you have people to talk to, and that as you're building your culture, as you're building your technology, you're doing it with an eye toward global scale and not just making the thing work. So that is my biggest call to action. And obviously, anyone and everyone should feel free to reach out to us, particularly if you have a project that you think might be in the sweet spot for us to understand and take a look at. But we're really excited to talk to folks and hopefully to help them make this journey.
And your geographic focus?
I would say we're mostly focused on the US because we're largely a domestically focused team. We're very interested in working outside the US as well if we have the right partners who can help us understand differences in kind of regulation perspectives and country differences and so forth. So we need to have strong partnerships to be able to work outside the US, but we're open to that.
I lied. I have one more question. So this challenge of hiring, I could have a whole podcast just on this, because what I see a lot in the earlier stages are like two brilliant scientists coming off of their PhDs, doing excellent research work, not at all thinking about how to grow their balance sheet or raise project finance or hire the right commercial people from adjacent industries, right? Because nobody's ever done any of this stuff before. But they can't, because they've raised a 1 or 2 million round and they need to hire, let's say, if it's software, then it's a software developer, but they need to hire sort of the core people. So how do they get around that? It's a little bit of the chicken and the egg. Do they just in the beginning try to raise a larger round so that they can start thinking about their hiring needs ahead of time? Or how do they get around this thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm probably not the world's expert on all of this, but here's what I think is that, the reality is obviously that there are competing uses of funds. And I think the good news is, particularly for early stage climate tech startups, there isn't a single path that is the right one. And there are a lot of models that can work. And I think we've seen examples of climate technology companies started by two deeply technical founders that have done really incredible things. And it depends on so many factors. And there are people who can amass whole new skill sets in the context of building a company. And it's super cool to watch. I think the key thing is to remember that a full-time hire is not necessarily always the right answer. And so it goes back to the sort of other piece that I mentioned, which is make friends, show up to conferences and just remember that your ecosystem shouldn't just be the one in which you're currently living. It should also be kind of the next stage forward, right? That it's great to go and interact with venture capitalists and spend lots of time with them and go to RPE and things like that. But also think about ways that you can start to get to know the infrastructure investment world and start to find mentors and folks out there, because everyone cares if you're in climate, if you're doing this work, it's not because you don't care, because this is so much harder than so many other things, right?
Yeah.
So that means that there are people who will be willing to help you and they'll be willing to offer advice. And I think if you can create those connections and make sure that those connections go well beyond your current phase into the next phase and even the phase after that, I think that will put you in really good standing to try to make some of the best decisions that you can at the moment. And then later on down the road, once you're able to raise those bigger rounds, once you really need those full-time hires to really get the people that you need and want in the door.
Yeah. And it's a hard thing to do, because a lot of these technologies, like these infrastructures, these massive things, like I interviewed H2 Green Steel, and they had to recruit people from all over the world, from the Middle East, pay for them to move because they were working in oil and gas, because nobody knows how to create green steel using hydrogen. And they had the capital because they raised $6 billion in 2 years. So they had the advantage of doing that, but you usually don't see it. It's really a big problem, the hiring problem.
Yeah.
And I feel like we don't talk about it enough. But that was my last question. So thank you. And thank you for waking up extra early to do this.
Of
and
course.
I would love to revisit in a year or so and find out how you guys are doing.
Gosh, me too. That sounds great. Thank you so much, Samia.
And that is it for today's episode with Lara Pierpoint. If you found this episode useful, then please rate and subscribe this podcast, because it helps other people find us. And I will catch you at the next one. Bye, everyone.